Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop on the ins and outs of CSI and ATSI. So before we get started, let's take a minute to check in. Although today we're going to focus on CSI and ATSI, let's take a moment to look ahead and reflect on what are we planning to do during spring break. Whether you're taking any time off or not, think about what are you looking forward to the most? Place in the chat what you are looking for. What are you looking forward to doing? Or maybe what are you looking forward to not doing? So again, a cruise, sleep. I'm with you on that. Oh, jury duty. Wonderful. Again, what are you looking forward to the most? Some travel, some hobbies, sleeping in, reading, maybe catching up on some work. Wonderful. Definitely like the margaritas.
I want to know more about the Dude Ranch. Is that where do we sign up for that?
Wonderful.
Angela's got a big birthday too.
Exciting.
Happy birthday, Angela.
Well, I think we'll get started. Okay, thank you so much. So now that you hopefully see what lies ahead for you, we can now return to the present moment and begin today's workshop. We want to welcome you, and hopefully we'll be able to address all your questions about CSI and ATSI, and we are happy here to have everybody here that is going to be presenting today. This is the agenda we're going to be going over. So today we have the LCAP-SFP unit and we have the Accountability Data and Literacy unit. So today presenting is Debbie Kano, Helen Choi, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and we're happy to have Evan Bartelheim and Hillary Weisman presenting today. Today we're going to cover the criteria for CSI and ATSI identification, the planning requirements for CSI and ATSI. We're also going to cover the comprehensive needs assessment and root cause analysis. You'll learn more about resource inequity. We definitely we always get questions about resource inequities and evidence-based interventions. Then we're going to focus on the LEA's responsibility for supporting CSI and ATSI schools. And of course, my personal favorite, how to maintain documentation for CSI, ATSI schools for your federal program monitoring reviews. And then we will end the afternoon with the criteria and timeline for exiting both CSI and ATSI. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box and we will answer any questions if we can. And we will also follow up with written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to everyone who's registered. And as also, we are recording today's training and we'll post this on our website. So let's begin. I will now turn it over to Evan Bartelheim, who will go over the criteria for eligibility.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm sure some of you are feeling like that classic David Byrne Talking Head song. And you're asking yourself, well, how did I get here? So we're going to go over that right now. Next slide, please. So for 2022, the state was required to restart accountability. Federal regulations required California to begin identifying schools based on the available metrics on the California dashboard, which included the state indicators for academic performance in ELA and math, English learner progress, chronic absenteeism, suspension, and graduation. There's no college career indicator this year, and local indicators aren't used at the school level, so it was just those 5 indicators. In addition, AB 130, which was passed in 2021, prohibited the use of prior year's data on the dashboard, and without the 2 years of statewide data, eligibility can only be determined using 2021-22 status data. Without the 2 years of data to provide both the status and the annual change, the use of the dashboard 5x5 grids wasn't possible. So the dashboard was introduced with these, now probably familiar to you, purple cell phone bars with the performance that ranged from the lowest to the highest, represented by really crappy reception to really nice reception. And a very low performance level on state indicators served as a proxy for red this year. Next slide, please. And so before we go any further, you're going to see some graphics, and I just wanted to share with you. And Hillary, can you drop this in the chat? Or I can drop it in a minute. We have this great dashboard at a glance tool that our friends at San Bernardino County created for us, and it's got 2 pages to it. You can actually get to the school level, and this includes all of the LEAs, all the districts in LA County. And if you're at a charter, your school is listed under your authorizing district. So you can actually get this kind of dashboard at a glance, which is nice to see all of your indicators in one shot. And this is going to be pretty helpful as we're going through and giving some examples of what qualified. Next slide, please. So the first thing we'll go over is the first in this hierarchical process. The first identified level of schools is those schools identified for CSI low graduation rate. These consist of schools that have a 3-year graduation rate using the combined 4- and 5-year high school graduation rate that is below 68%. This low graduation rate criteria is applied to both Title I funded and non-Title I schools. And the schools must also have reported graduation rate data for 2020, 21, and 22 to be eligible. One important note, the graduation rate from 2020 and 2021 had to be recalculated for the district alternative status schools or DOS schools using the combined 4- and 5-year graduation rate. Previously, they had a 1-year graduation rate, and the Department of Education denied California's DOS methodology waiver request last July. So they had a last-minute scramble. They had to recalculate all the averages, and those data files, if you really want to wonk out, were recently re-uploaded to the CDE with the recalculated data. Next slide, please. The next category is the CSI lowest performing schools. This is one that's a little bit confusing to me. It used to be, so maybe we can clarify it for you. In 2022, the CSI lowest performing category consists of schools that did receive Title I funding. So they have to be Title I funded schools in the 2021-22 school year. So there were a couple of schools that were no longer taking Title I funds were on the list, and we're wondering, how did I get here? It was if you received Title I funding in 2021-22. And these are the lowest performing schools based on the 2022 dashboard. Per ESSA, no less than 5% of the Title I funded schools must be included in this category. So this gets into the criteria we're going to talk about. So the state has to identify at a minimum the lowest 5%. They don't stop right at 5%. They have to identify criteria and get to a count of schools that it represents at least 5%. So it could be slightly higher. It can't be any lower. The schools, there's eligibility categories are hierarchical. So before they calculate the lowest performing schools, they take out those Title I funded schools that were eligible for CSI based on the graduation rate. And schools could only be eligible for one criteria for CSI. So they removed all those low grad rate schools, and then they looked at the remaining Title I schools to determine CSI. Next slide. So the lowest performing Title I funded schools were determined based on state indicators from the dashboard using the status level combinations that schools receive at the school level, which means all students. So not the student groups, but all students, the highest level. And the first 2 criteria that for eligibility that the state board adopted in 2022-23, this is approved in March of last year, were schools that had all indicators at the lowest status level and schools with all indicators at the lowest status levels, except for one indicator at another level. And so what's unique this year is the first criterion applies for schools that have at least one state indicator with an end value of 30 or greater. And in the past, it was 2. So this was a little bit different than prior years. Additionally, the second criterion applies for schools that have 2 or more indicators that have met that 30 or greater end value. And the CDE, then they had additional criteria, but they determined after applying these first 2 criteria to Title I schools that the state had met the requirement. They had enough schools identified based on those 2 criteria that they didn't have to identify anymore. They met their minimum 5%. And there was a third criterion, which was schools with 5 or more indicators where majority are at the lowest status level. That was not applied, but it was kind of floated out there. So I think some people were a little bit confused thinking that might still apply. It did not. Next slide, please. So I pulled up some samples using that dashboard we showed earlier, and we can just take a quick glance at these. So for the criterion one, which was all indicators very low, you can see we had a school here where they had 4 indicators. So they had both of their ELA and math were the very low category, and their suspension rate also was in the very low, which per the earlier slides, very low, meaning they had a very high suspension rate for all students. And their chronic absenteeism also, it was the very lowest performance category because they had very high chronic absenteeism, which of course everybody had this year. Another sample though, this is one kind of probably throw people off, is here's a school that's identified with only 1 indicator. So they only had, based on kind of the criteria that they used, and it's kind of one of those quirks of how the business rules are applied to each indicator. So you see for the ELA and math, they only had 4 students who were calculated ELA math, so they didn't receive an indicator. So they didn't have enough students to be eligible. They had to have 30 or more. And they only had 12 students for graduation rate, but for school climate, their suspension rate, they had 105 students because of the business rules applied, and it was very low. So 1 indicator identified for CSI low performing. The second criterion is represented kind of in a more broad perspective here. Just as an example, I had a district or a school, excuse me, that had 4 indicators here. Grad rate was actually medium, but they had the other 3 remaining indicators were all very low. So they had all but 1 were very low. So that were 2 examples that we saw, and that should look familiar. We did have a lot of CSI schools, but this should be familiar to those who are there. Next slide, please. So ESSA also required that states determine which schools are eligible for what's called targeted support and improvement, TSI, and additional targeted support and improvement, ATSI. And these are based on the individual student group performance. And this year was a lot more widely applied. So under California's ESSA plan, schools that are not eligible for either CSI low grad rate or CSI low performance will be eligible for TSI, ATSI, and importantly, both Title I funded and non-Title I funded schools are eligible for TSI, ATSI if they have 1 or more student groups that for 2 consecutive years meet the criteria applied to determine at least the lowest performing 5% Title I funded schools. I put a little asterisk there because there was an exception this year. They had to change the rules somewhat because the dashboard rules changed. And if you go to the next slide, I'll cover that. 2 things that changed. So first of all, TSI, everybody's like, what is TSI? I keep hearing it. So normally TSI eligibility would be determined annually, while ATSI was supposed to be determined every 3 years, with the intention to ultimately line it up with the identification would line up with the LCAP 3-year cycle. As a result, TSI, however, has yet to be identified since the state's ESSA plan was approved. They've continued to try to align it, and then prior to the pandemic, the state was intending to identify TSI with the 2020 dashboard, and we know how that went. So as of now, ATSI determinations will be made. They were made this year. They'll be made again in 2023-24. And then TSI determinations won't be made until 2024-25. Using data from the 2024 dashboard. To be honest with you, I just had a conversation with the CDE's accountability unit the other day, and they said stay tuned. Even then, TSI, who knows? There's still work to be done as far as the identification. So now we're just on ATSI. So next slide, please. So the additional adjustments, though, and this gets back to that 2 years. So there are some additional adjustments that went through in what was called the COVID-19 addendum. So California's approved addendum included language in which the state indicated that ATSI eligibility in 22-23 had to be based on only 1 year of dashboard results because we only had the 1 year that could be included per AB 130. So we have only the status, right? We don't have the status and change. So based on that addendum, schools are eligible for ATSI if 1 or more of the student groups meet one of the same 2 criteria that were used for determining CSI. So they use the same criteria applied at the student group level. And so those are all indicators at the lowest status level, again, or all indicators at the lowest status level, but 1 indicator at another status level. And similarly to CSI, the first criterion applies to all student groups that have at least 1 indicator, 30 or larger, and the second applies to what schools that have 2 or more indicators. One major difference, though, between CSI and ATSI, CSI is capped, right? It's just they have to reach that 5%, at a minimum, and then they stop. However, there's no cap on ATSI. They sweeps up any school that meets the criteria, and we had a lot of schools. Next slide, please. So here's some quick examples, and this is where I think a lot of confusion around ATSI came in. So the application, the first criterion you can see, here's an obvious one. You've got the student group had 4 separate indicators, all at the very low status. Makes perfectly good sense. Then you had another school with 2 indicators, all very low. I think you get down to that last one with the foster youth with 1 indicator, and this is what confused people. If you're thinking, but my other indicators didn't present there. Well, it's only the indicators which you have enough students to generate. So you're accountable for any indicators that have 30 or more. In this case, just 1 student group or 1 indicator had 30 or more, and that was very low. So they were identified for ATSI. Criterion 2, I think, is where we got the biggest confusion, because yes, you see the more common 3 of 4 are very low, but it is that 1 of 2. And this one really threw. We actually had schools that were both identified for awards. They're identified as not blue ribbon schools. Sorry, I'm blanking out on the name. And they're identified for ATSI. It seems counterintuitive. It is counterintuitive. It was a crazy year. And I think we just say accept it, and we're moving forward. So, but yes, you could have just 2 indicators. One could be very high, but if the chronic absenteeism typically was very low, boom, ATSI. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. So this is LA County. This is the numbers in CSI, ATSI, and you can see the big shift, and it really was an ATSI. So in 2019, only 175 schools in LA County were identified for ATSI. This year, almost 1,400 schools identified for ATSI because of those rules. And of course, chronic absenteeism was a big problem everywhere. And the post-pandemic or mid-pandemic testing, we had a lot of drops in academic indicators. So these were all problems. You see, there weren't a lot of changes. CSI grad, we had a slight uptick, and that could probably be mostly accounted for with the changes in the DOS school rules and the need to apply the 4- and 5-year indicators. And Rachel's going to talk a little more about DOS schools in a minute. And we actually had a drop from 61 to 58 in the CSI low performing. So if you're feeling like you're being picked on just for being identified for ATSI, you were actually in the majority this year. And that's likely going to change next year when we move into another dashboard that has both status and change, and we see any improvement will change. We'll talk about exit criteria later. For now, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Debbie. She'll talk about planning requirements.
Thanks, Evan. Okay, so we're going to go over the planning requirements for CSI and ATSI. Next slide, please. As shared during last month's state and federal program directors meeting, the LEAs must collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a CSI plan. The CSI plan must be informed by all state indicators, including student performance, against the state-determined long-term goals. To do this, you're going to start with the California School Dashboard to understand how the school became eligible for CSI, as Evan discussed earlier in our presentation. Then the dashboard will inform you about the specific indicators that contributed to your school's eligibility. And this is a great starting point to then gather school level data to analyze and potentially identify the trends that led to eligibility and help prioritize specific focus areas in the CSI plan. The CSI plan must be based on a school level needs assessment. You want to conduct a needs assessment for each CSI site, review the data and the needs assessment of the school and the needs of the school to assess the reasons why the school became eligible for CSI. The needs assessment may include a review of quantitative and qualitative data analysis, such as an empathy interview or observations. The needs assessment should eventually lead to a root cause analysis to help determine the underlying causes that led to the CSI eligibility. The CSI plan must also include evidence-based interventions, strategies, and activities that could be employed to address those needs. Evidence-based interventions are those practices and programs that have evidence to show that they are actually effective at producing results and improving student achievement outcomes. The CSI plan must also identify resource inequities and address those inequities through the plan, which may include a review of the LEA and school level budgeting. So when doing this, the CSI planning team could ask questions such as, is there something more the school needs in order to improve student outcomes beyond what is provided to all schools? CSI plans for the 23-24 school year must be fully developed and approved at the local level. The plan should be ready to be implemented no later than the first day of the 23-24 school year. This is to ensure a full year of support consistent with the LEA's CSI plan for that school. Next slide, please. Upon notification of ATSI status by the LEA, the school is required to collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a school level plan to improve outcomes for each subgroup of students that cause the school to be identified for ATSI. The school plan must adhere to the following requirements. It is to be informed by all state indicators on the California dashboard. This include evidence-based interventions and identify resource inequities at the school and LEA level. The 23-24 ATSI plan must also be approved at the local level, both at the school level and the LEA level, and should be ready to be implemented no later than the first day of the 23-24 school year. Next slide. So please keep in mind that the federal planning requirements established in Ed Code section 64001 allows the SPSA to meet ESSA requirements for CSI and ATSI planning and allows single school districts and charter schools to utilize the LCAP to serve as the SPSA so long as it meets ESSA planning and educational partner requirements. And now we're going to turn it over to Hillary to go in depth with comprehensive need assessment and root cause analysis.
Thank you, Debbie. As Debbie mentioned, a comprehensive needs assessment, next slide, please, will need to take place. So a comprehensive needs assessment is a systemic process to better understand the areas of strength and the areas of improvement of a school and or an LEA. It is the first step in program development and provides educational partners with an opportunity to hypothesize about the causes or causation of student achievement, services provided, and or school outcomes. And at its core, a comprehensive needs assessment is part of an ongoing continuous improvement cycle that includes both long-range performance goals and short-cycle implementation targets. Next slide, please. There are many needs assessments. Sometimes they can be referred to as comprehensive needs assessments, segmented needs assessments, consolidated needs assessments, equity audits, school quality review, diagnostic assessments, diagnostic review, or a diagnostic inquiry, just to name a few. Regardless of the type, there are some basic fundamental components within the process that enable LEAs, schools, and educational partners to examine strengths, weaknesses, and the areas in which improvement is needed while also understanding gaps in service as it relates to student performance and school outcomes. The steps involved in the comprehensive needs assessment template, which have been added to the resource section on the Canvas page, are organized into 3 buckets. In the initial phases of the needs assessment, there is a heavy focus on broad data analysis to provide a rich stream of information. This information is funneled through educational partners and data teams so as to be categorized and arranged into focused areas and subsequently prioritized by greatest need. Towards the conclusion of the needs assessment, there will be a need to dig deeper to better understand the root cause of the initial data that drew attention towards the problem. Next slide, please. As an optional resource, a needs assessment template has been provided. Please take note that the template also includes some data analysis protocols and a sample focus area for priority 5 chronic absenteeism at the end. Within this sample, there are sections that suggest possible contributing factors to chronic absenteeism, current considerations, and additional analysis points. This template is intended to support your planning requirements, house evidence, and capture work done amongst various educational audiences. The root cause is defined as the deepest underlying cause or causes of positive or negative symptoms within any process that, if dissolved, would result in elimination or substantial reduction of the symptom. A root cause analysis is part of the needs assessment process. It is a strategy to thoroughly examine practices, processes, and routines to determine their impact on outcomes. It answers the why behind each identified area of improvement. Representatives from all educational partner groups can and should participate. Some of the educational groups to consider might include district personnel, local boards of education, families and community members, school personnel, students, and district hired external partners. There is no single method for conducting a root cause analysis. Rather, a root cause analysis can be composed of different tools, processes, protocols, and perspectives that support a systemic investigation of contributing and foundational causes of challenges. However, there are some common steps involved in the root cause analysis process, which can include defining a problem to be addressed and gathering data and evidence relevant to the problem. Additionally, identifying potential causes of the problem and determining the root cause of the problem. And lastly, identifying evidence-based strategies to address the problem. This slide identifies a few of the most commonly used root cause analysis tools. Please keep in mind, since there is no single way to conduct a root cause analysis, depending on the context, you may involve any one or a combination of these tools. Regardless of the tool, it is crucial that you take the time to analyze, synthesize, prioritize, and summarize the data before moving to the next steps. And I'm going to go ahead and hand off the next section of resource inequalities, to Debbie.
Thank you, Hillary. So as she said, we will discuss resource inequities in more detail in this section. Next slide, please. Schools eligible for CSI or ATSI must identify and describe any resource inequities identified as a result of the required needs assessment, as mentioned earlier, which may include a review of the LEA's budgeting, its LCAP, and the school level budgeting, if applicable. While not explicitly required in an LCAP, an LEA may choose to address resource inequities in their LCAP. However, single school LEAs that choose to use the LCAP to meet school planning requirements for CSI and ATSI must identify resource inequities in their LCAP. The review and identification of resource inequities is important because they can inform the effectiveness of our existing actions and strategies. Where you see concerns in your data from your needs assessment, or especially in relation to disparities between student groups, you are seeing signs of potential resource inequities. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview of program requirements for CSI schools and ATSI schools and highlights the reference to the requirements for the identification of resource inequities. And again, it is very clear that the identification of resource inequities is a requirement for all schools identified both CSI and ATSI. And for schools in CSI, the LEA is required to support the schools in the process of developing the school plan, and a description of which is included in the LEA's LCAP. Next slide. This is a screenshot from the CDE's SPSA template. If your LEA uses a locally developed SPSA template, you can just see here what's required is that you're addressing the requirements to review and identify resource inequities, and it can be as simple as a text box in which the school would provide a narrative response. And this is a federal requirement for CSI plans and ATSI plans per ESSA, and is included in the Federal Program Monitoring School Support Improvement Program Instrument, or SSI 01. For For all other schools, the identification of resource inequities is identified as an element that shall be included in the SPSAs per California Education Code. Next slide. The CDE suggests that LEAs may identify resource inequities by examining how programs might be unfair or lack inclusion. Fairness is defined in this context to mean that a student's personal characteristics are not an obstacle to their achievement. For example, if I'm a female student from a low-income family, question is, can I still achieve? Do I have access to the same quality of instruction? Inclusion in this context is defined as expectations that apply to all students. As that same female from a low-income background, am I expected to achieve less due to my personal characteristics? So fairness and inclusion can be impacted by resource inequities, and examples of those go beyond funding allocated to the schools. These could be manifested in quality and access to a variety of resources. Next slide, please. With that, looking at the terms fairness and inclusion, these are some things to consider. We know that students who come to school with greater need require greater resources to achieve the same high-level outcomes. We understand that personal characteristics such as gender or ethnicity should not stand as obstacles to achievement. We understand that we must hold the same high expectations for all students, and failing to do so is an inequity in and of itself. Therefore, any gaps we see between student groups should be potential symptoms of resource inequity. When we see a disproportionate representation of one student group with a high rate of dropout or attendance or discipline or achievement issues, schools are compelled to review what might be contributing to these issues. What might be the conditions that can be addressed to move towards more equitable outcomes for students. Since students with greater needs require greater resources, providing equal resources or giving all students the same means that the system has created resource inequities. Equal services inevitably yields inequitable support. Next slide, please. The purpose of a review of resource inequities is described on the CDE's CSI webpage, so that the review of the data around resource inequities can be used to identify, diagnose, and address sources of inequity to inform improvement decisions. This review can go hand in hand with the needs assessment process with a lens on equity. The outcomes and identified areas of inequity would then be areas targeted and addressed in the school plan. Now I'm going to turn it over to Helen to continue with this section.
Thank you, Debbie.
Mhm.
So in considering resource inequities, we need to start with an understanding of what resource equity is. This definition comes from a working paper on this subject by Jonathan Travers, published through the Educational Resource Services, or ERS, looking at numerous studies related to the subject. As you can see, a review of resource inequities is not only about money. It is not only about the allocation of funds to the schools. It's about the allocation and use of resources beyond dollars allocated, and also people and time used to create equitable learning experiences for all students. So furthermore, CDE also provided resources and definitions and characteristics around equity. Any goal of competitiveness and excellence must start with equity or be doomed to fail. It is important to remember that students come to schools with diverse backgrounds, abilities, talents, and challenges. Schools ensure equity by recognizing, respecting, and acting on this diversity. A common misconception and perception is that equity means that all students are treated equally in all situations. In fact, high-quality schools have the capacity to differentiate instruction, services, and resource distribution to respond effectively to diverse needs of their students, with the aim of ensuring that all students benefit equally. In the next few slides, we'll be sharing some resources to help LEAs and schools to identify the resource inequities. If you attended our SSE workshop earlier this year, we shared a resource that provided us with the framework for identifying potential resource inequities. This framework came from working paper by Jonathan Travers through a collaboration with ERS. This is a framework for districts and schools to going through the process of reviewing potential resource inequities. In the ERS paper, Jonathan Travers explored 11 dimensions of resource inequity and developed a set of diagnostic questions that can help systems self-assess. He classified dimensions number 1 through 7 on the slide as factors that are directly impact the student experience, and 8 through 11 as indirect impacts. There are 7 factors that directly impact student experiences, and they include teacher quality, early intervention, and family academic engagement. And the factors that indirectly impact student experiences include school leadership quality and learning-ready facilities. And I'd like to share a copy of this article, and that's linked on this slide. This here is a handout, and this is a LACO-developed handout adapted from the Travers work. This resource takes each of the 11 dimensions of resource equity and poses a set of questions to help districts or schools self-assess their current system. And this is a sample from the chart on the previous slide showing the questions associated with one of the dimensions. In this case, this addresses rigor and expectations. Here is another resource that can be accessed through the website Alliance for Resource Equity. This website also provides resources for schools and educational partners to facilitate the process of reviewing resource inequities, and the link is also included on this slide. So one process to support identification of resource inequities starts with a thorough data analysis and to identify at least one indicator that needs greater attention. Then determine which dimension or dimensions are most impacted and connected to this area. Then use these resources to create a deeper understanding and help determine the resource inequities within the system. After discussion with varying teams, resource inequities will be determined and can be summarized. Then the LEAs or schools can explore evidence-based interventions that can best address the identified resource inequities. And here again, I want to remind you again the definition of equity that we referenced today. Resource equity is the allocation and use of resources, people, time, and money to create student experiences that enable all students to reach empowering, rigorous learning outcomes, no matter their race or income. Consider how this framework can be used as a discussion starter to create a common language and facilitate a meaningful discussion around equity and resource inequities. LEAs and school leaders can ask themselves what it means to provide all students an opportunity to achieve educational excellence. At the system level, look at the equity or inequity across schools and or across different student groups. At the school level, looking at equity or inequity across classrooms, grade levels, departments, content areas, and or student groups. And on this slide are additional question starters that may be used as a discussion starter. And finally, how can LEA support the process of reviewing and identifying resource inequities? Here are some general suggestions. A review of resource inequities can be based on contextual needs. At the LEA level, supporting CSI schools in this process, the LEA may choose to focus or limit the number of dimensions to consider based on school or district priorities. It is definitely connected to the needs assessment process and selection of evidence-based strategies that will help address those needs. And one key takeaway here is that if the needs assessment identifies student data, school processes, or programmatic or human capital disparities between student groups, these are potential areas of resource inequities. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that a school would conclude that there are no resource inequities identified in the schools. And that's it for our section. And now I'll turn it over to Jeannie for evidence-based interventions. Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we'll define evidence-based interventions and revisit the categories in the improvement process that have been discussed so far, and also introduce some steps in selecting an intervention, an evidence-based intervention, and share some resources for your consideration. Next slide, please. So to recap our learning from today for a brief moment, so far your LEA or school has been identified for CSI or ATSI, and you understand the eligibility criteria, and you've learned about the planning requirements, and you may have identified an area of improvement through a needs assessment, root cause analysis, and a review of resource inequities in your LEA and school. So now that you've taken stock of some of the most pressing issues and the situations you believe need to be improved, your LEA and school are ready to research, identify, and select evidence-based interventions to help achieve improved outcomes for students. Next slide, please. And so it's important to understand how ESSA defines an evidence-based intervention. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, an evidence-based intervention is an approach that has evidence to show that it is effective in producing results and improving outcomes when it's implemented. The intervention that targets a problem and outcome aligned with the context of your school or LEA may be a strategy, a practice, or a program, and it may be included in a policy within your school or district. When selecting an evidence-based intervention for your identified problem of practice or area of improvement, it's important to please keep in mind that it must have a proven track record through studies and findings that demonstrate the following key components. There is evidence that shows the practice, strategy, or program is effective, and that the use of the practice, program, or strategy leads to improved outcomes for student achievement. Next slide, please. Section 8101 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act defines the distinction between evidence-based strategies that have been proven to have a statistically significant effect on improving student achievement and those that demonstrate a rationale or likelihood based on research to date to impact student achievement. These criteria are reflected in the 4 tiers of evidence-based intervention. So moving to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about these tiers of intervention so that we understand how they are determined and the range from tier 1 to tier 4. So tiers of evidence for interventions and their ratings are determined by the research study criteria. And the more controlled the criteria that is applied in the research study provides an increase in the strength of evidence. And so listed here on the slide are 4 tiers of evidence-based interventions. And the first one is tier 1. This is the highest level of evidence available. And to qualify as having a high level of evidence, the intervention must have what is known as a well-designed and well-implemented experimental study to support it. And what this means in technical terms is that a randomized control experiment occurred with a treatment group that received the intervention and a control group or a comparison group that did not receive the intervention. And the participants in each of these groups were randomly assigned. There was at least 350 participants, and there was a statistically significant effect on the student or the other outcome, which researchers found that the effects of the intervention were noteworthy and directly related to the intervention. It was determined that the outcome was not the result of chance or any other input,
And so it was clear that the intervention led to favorable results, such as increasing student achievement. Of course, with each of these tiers of evidence, it's critical that the intervention has relevance to the specific context, including similar student populations or similar school settings. The second level of evidence is moderate evidence. And to receive a tier 2 level of evidence, there must have been at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study. And so in this case, a control experiment has a treatment group where the experiment was conducted with a group that received the intervention and a control group that did not. And participants in these groups are not randomly assigned. So the comparison group might not take into account factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, self-selection to not participate. So while there may be a group to compare to, it may be not as comparable as a group created through random assignment. So that's the distinction between tier 1 and tier 2, is these comparison groups, one has random assignment and one does not. Right, moving down to the tier 3 level. This is promising evidence. And for this designation, there must have been at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study to support the findings. And so in this case, it's a study, not an experiment that took place to determine if there was a relationship between the intervention and a specific outcome. And a correlational study is usually done through data collection and analysis within the correlational study. So it shows that the intervention provided a correlation. And so the statistically significant effect on the student or other relevant outcomes, in this case for promising evidence, means that the researchers found that the effects of the intervention were noteworthy and again, not directly related to the intervention. The outcome was not the result of chance or any other input. And so the intervention here led to favorable results, again, resulting in student achievement. Tier 4 is the lowest tier, and it involves interventions that demonstrate a rationale. And these interventions have a clear and effective logic model or theory of action that explains how the intervention is likely to improve relevant outcomes. They are supported by research, and there is an effort in place either by the state, the district, the charter, or an outside research organization to determine their effectiveness. And it's important to note that the brackets on each of the slides, each side of the slides, indicate that schools in ATSI may select evidence-based interventions from tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the schools eligible for CSI low performing or CSI low grad rate may only select evidence-based intervention from the highest tiers 1, 2, and 3. All right, next slide, please. So we wanted to share this guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that is provided for you on the slide. And this guidance seeks to help LEAs, schools, and educational partners understand the 4 levels of evidence. It also recommends a step-by-step process for choosing and implementing interventions that improve outcomes for students. Part 1 of the guidance reviews the first steps necessary before any decision is made for the selection of evidence-based interventions. Step 1 in the process is to engage in meaningful consultation with the broad range of educational partners to examine relevant data and the most pressing needs of the schools, and to determine the root causes for those needs. As noted by the star next to step 2, following this initial step of identifying local needs and areas of improvement, the LEA is ready to support identified CSI and ATSI schools through the process of selecting the most promising and relevant evidence-based intervention, always considering the local district and school level resources. In addition to the tiered level of intervention, LEAs and schools will need to consider costs of implementing the interventions, staffing requirements, professional development planning, and how that intervention would fit into the context of your educational setting. Other considerations may also include a discussion of whether the intervention will be classroom focused, student group focused, or implemented school-wide. So once your school has identified evidence-based interventions that support the area of improvement, and it has reviewed and discussed their relevance to your setting and context, it's likely that through implementation with fidelity, you are ready to finally select one or more of the evidence-based interventions. And then as an LEA in a school, you'd be ready for step 3, which develops the plan for implementation of the selected one or more interventions. And then you would be prepared to begin the 23-24 school year with implementation of the interventions and continuous monitoring through continuous examination and reflection of the impact of your intervention. And for your reference, part 2 of this resource provides explicit information regarding the definitions for each of those tiers of intervention that we reviewed. All right, moving on to the next slide. Here, this slide offers multiple resources that include evidence-based interventions that an LEA may consider to address their local needs. There are databases that provide ratings for evidence-based programs and practices, such as the Evidence for ESSA database through Johns Hopkins University, as well as the What Works Clearinghouse, which is through the Institute of Education Sciences through the U.S. Department of Education. Additionally, from the U.S. Department of Education is a document included called Using Evidence to Create Next Generation High Schools. This resource highlights 6 general evidence-based strategies to improve America's high schools. The strategies address practices that engage students and help them prepare for college and career success. Though many of the effective strategies may share many common features, each has been identified by the research literature as a standalone intervention or model for improving students' educational outcomes. The strategies reviewed for enhancing high school and college outcomes include participation in rigorous curriculum, small learning communities, small schools of choice, career academies, dual enrollment, early college high schools, and college and career counseling. Additionally, on the slide is an evidence-based improvement guide from WestEd, which offers some tools to support LEAs with engaging schools and their educational partners to understand their needs and select and support the implementation of relevant evidence-based interventions. And additionally, the CDE website includes a section with links to multiple resources for continuous improvement, including those listed here and others for evidence-based interventions. So quickly on the next couple slides, we're just going to highlight some examples. And so in today's presentation, we're going to look at the What Works Clearinghouse website. And here you can see that on the website, it provides practice guides that highlights particular evidence-based strategies and their tiered level of evidence, as well as intervention reports that provide tiered levels of evidence for specific programs or studies that have been reviewed. And going on to the next slide is an example of the practice guides. The practice guides share evidence of specific strategies and expert guidance from panels of experts in the field with experience related to the topic of study. The practice guides are published to provide educators with the best available evidence and expertise on current challenges in education. What Works Clearinghouse develops practice guides in conjunctions with these expert panels, and this combines the panel's expertise with findings of existing rigorous research to produce specific recommendations for addressing education-related challenges. The What Works Clearinghouse and panel rate the strength of the research evidence supporting each of their recommendations. So here on this slide are offered 3 guides. The first addresses recommendations for providing reading intervention in grades 4 through 9. The second addresses assisting struggling students in math in the elementary grades. And the third addresses strategies to prevent dropout in secondary schools. These guides offer evidence-based recommendations or strategies that may not be readily solved within a single program. And so the guides synthesize the best publicly available research and share practices that are supported by evidence. They are really intended to be practical and easy for teachers and school leaders to use. And on the next slide, we can see on the site where users can search in many ways for relevant practice guides using multiple filters, such as publication dates, topic areas addressing specific academic areas, social emotional learning, grade levels, as well as filtering by specific populations served. And on the next slide, we also see where What Works Clearinghouse provides reviews of specific intervention programs. This is an example of a review about the Read 180 reading intervention program. And it includes levels of evidence that connect to specific literacy outcomes, provides a summary of research settings in which the research was conducted, and additionally, more specific details about the program information and costs are included for the specific intervention reviews. And now our next section will address the LEA's responsibilities for schools that are eligible for comprehensive support and improvement.
Thank you, Jeannie. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Jeannie mentioned in this section, we're going to take a look at the LEA's responsibilities. So once a school is identified for CSI, the LEA is responsible for developing and implementing a plan for the school to improve student outcomes. And so as Debbie mentioned earlier, this is something that must be done in partnership with educational partners. So that includes principals, other school leaders, teachers, and parents. And the plan must also be approved by both the school and the LEA. And then again, as mentioned previously, CSI plans for the 2023-24 school year must be developed and approved by the first day of the 2023-24 school year. It's also important to note that the CSI plan is required of all CSI schools, regardless of whether or not the LEA receives CSI funds. And so the only exception to this is for those DOS community of practice schools that are eligible for CSI under low graduation rate criteria and have less than 100 students and choose to forgo implementation of the CSI related improvement activities. And so we'll be taking a closer look at this exception a little bit later in the presentation. And then an additional responsibility is that LEAs with schools that meet the criteria for CSI must also complete the CSI prompts that are located in the plan summary section of the LCAP. And so here we see a screenshot of the 3 CSI prompts that LEAs must complete. And so remember, this section only applies to those LEAs with a school or schools identified for CSI based on the 2022 dashboard data. So this section does not apply to ATSI. And so the CSI list that was released in February, it identifies all of the schools that need to be identified for each LEA. And so we've included the link to this list on the slide for your reference. It's important to note that the list may include schools that continue to be eligible, as well as some schools that are newly identified. And so the focus of this section is how the LEA is supporting the identified schools with the development, monitoring, and evaluation of the 2023-24 CSI plan. So for the first CSI prompt, LEAs will need to provide the names of the schools identified for CSI. Then in the second prompt, LEAs will describe how they supported the CSI school in developing their CSI plan. And so this description needs to include how the LEA has supported or will support the CSI school or schools with conducting a school level needs assessment and data analysis, as well as identifying evidence-based interventions and identifying any resource inequities to be addressed through the plan. Then the last prompt asks for a description of how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the implementation of the CSI plan, as well as how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the plan. In situations where a previously identified school continues to be eligible for CSI, the response should reflect the LEA's process for supporting the school with plan development, implementation, and evaluation for the 2023-24 school year. And so it's likely that the monitoring and evaluation of this year's plan may inform the needs assessment for the plan revision. So next we have the LEA responsibilities for ATSI. So when a school is identified for ATSI, the LEA is responsible for notifying the school that it has been identified for ATSI, and the notification must include the student groups in the school that are consistently underperforming. And unlike CSI, with ATSI, the school is responsible for the development and implementation of the plan, not the LEA. However, the LEA is responsible for approval of the plan, as well as monitoring the implementation of the plan. And additionally, the LEA is required to take additional action if after a number of years, as determined by the LEA, the implementation of the plan is unsuccessful. And then one other important thing to note is that additional SF funding is not available for ATSI schools. So the additional SF funding is only available for LEAs that serve CSI schools. So we've received several requests from LEAs regarding a sample ATSI notification letter. So we created a sample notification that LEAs can adapt to meet their specific needs. So here you can see a screenshot of that sample letter, and we've also included it with today's resources. And so the highlighted areas are where you would enter your specific school and district information. And so the key to remember with the notification is that it needs to inform the school that they've been identified for ATSI, and then it must also specify which specific student groups caused that identification. Next, we're going to review the dashboard alternative school status flexibilities for CSI. So this slide provides some background information on dashboard alternative school status, otherwise known as DAS. So DAS schools are alternative schools that serve high-risk students, such as continuation, community day schools, opportunity schools, and juvenile court schools. There are several school types that automatically qualify as alternative status per Education Code 52052D. And so these schools that are specified in that ed code are automatically placed into the DOS program. Additionally, there are other alternative schools that serve high-risk students, but are not specified in the Education Code. And so these schools may apply for the DOS program if they meet other alternative schools criteria. And additional information regarding the DOS eligibility requirements, including the application instructions for other alternative schools, can be found on the CDE website at the link provided on the slide. So DOS schools can be eligible for CSI and ATSI. And beginning with the release of the 2022 dashboard, DOS schools that meet eligibility criteria for CSI low graduation rate or CSI low performing will be referred to as DOS Community of Practice Schools, or DOS COP. And so LEAs can refer to the DOS column in the 2022-23 ESSA Assistant Status data file for the DOS program status. And we've included the link at the bottom of the slide. So at the September 2022 State Board of Education meeting, there were several changes and flexibilities approved by the State Board for DOS schools eligible for CSI. And so these changes and flexibilities that were approved for DOS schools came about after some back and forth between the CDE and the U.S. Department of Education, including the U.S. Department of Ed's denial of California's proposed amendment to its consolidated ESSA state plan in January 2022, and also the Department of Ed's denial of California's waiver request to implement an alternative accountability system for DOS schools in July 2022. So at the September 2022 meeting, the State Board granted approval for DOS COP schools identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria to implement differentiated improvement activities. And the statutory authority for these flexibilities are in ESSA section 111D. So per ESSA, the state may permit an LEA with a school that predominantly serves students returning to education after having exited secondary school without a regular high school diploma, or who based on their grade or age are significantly off track to accumulate sufficient credits to meet high school graduation requirements to participate in differentiated improvement activities. And so the next slide addresses the differentiated improvement activities that are available for DOS schools. So there are two differentiated improvement activity options that are available for these schools. The first differentiated improvement activity is available to any LEA that has a DOS COP school identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria with less than 100 enrolled students in the prior school year. And so this option allows the LEA to forego implementation of all CSI-related improvement activities for that specific DOS school. LEAs that choose to exercise this flexibility do not have to develop or implement a CSI plan for its DOS COP school eligible under CSI low grad rate and with less than 100 students. And they'll also forego the CSI funding that's associated with that school. Additionally, it's important to note that LEAs opting to exercise this flexibility and forego the implementation of CSI-related activities needed to indicate its intent to do so through the application for funding in GMART that was due on March 3rd. The second differentiated improvement activity is available to any LEA with a DOS COP school that's identified under the CSI low graduation rate criteria, regardless of the number of students enrolled. And so this option allows an LEA to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements. So with this option, there would not be a separate CSI plan for the school, but instead the CSI plan would be embedded within the LEA's LCAP. And so the next few slides address the CSI prompts for LEAs that choose to exercise the flexibilities that were just shared on the previous slide. And so this slide here applies to LEAs that opt for differentiated activity number 1. So again, that would be for those LEAs that have a DOS COP school identified under the CSI low graduation rate criteria and less than 100 enrolled students in the prior year, and also choose to forgo the implementation of all CSI-related improvement activities. So for those LEAs, you would need to complete the first prompt in the CSI section with specific language provided by the CDE that basically says you are choosing to forgo implementation of CSI-related activities and the applicable funding. LEAs that choose this option are not required to complete prompts 2 or 3. And so you can see a screenshot of the CSI prompts for your reference. And you can also find the standardized language that's required for prompt 1 on the CDE website at the link provided. The next 2 slides apply to those LEAs that opt for differentiated activity number 2. So for single school districts and direct funded charter schools with DOS COP schools that are eligible under CSI low graduation rate, regardless of the number of students enrolled, and choose to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, you would not need to complete prompt 1 in the CSI section. However, you are required to complete prompts 2 and 3. For traditional LEAs with DOS COP schools identified under CSI low graduation rate, again, regardless of the number of students enrolled, and choose to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, you are still required to complete all 3 prompts in the CSI section. So as mentioned on slide 63, differentiated improvement activity number 2 allows any LEA with the DOS COP school identified under CSI low grad rate the option to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements. So again, for those LEAs that choose this option, a separate CSI plan is not required for the school, but rather the CSI planning requirements must be addressed within the LCAP. And so here you can see the 5 CSI planning requirements that must be addressed within the LEA's LCAP. And LEAs have the flexibility to determine how to address these requirements within the LCAP, as long as all 5 requirements are addressed. So again, it's up to the LEA to determine how to best address the CSI planning requirements within the LCAP. However, the CDE has developed a CSI planning summary to assist LEAs with this process. And so the CSI planning summary, it explains where the CSI planning requirements might be addressed within the LCAP. And in addition to this planning summary, the CDE has posted guidance on this process on their CSI webpage at the link provided. And so here we see a screenshot of the CDE's CSI planning summary. So this screenshot shows 2 of the 5 CSI requirements that must be addressed within the LCAP for LEAs choosing this option. So for the first CSI planning requirement, the LEA may describe how it partnered with educational partners in the development of the CSI plan in either prompts 2 and 3 of the CSI summary section, or it could also be addressed in the engaging educational partner section. And so that's just one example, but you can access the full summary with all 5 CSI requirements at the link provided. And that concludes this section. I will now turn it over to Adrienne.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Next, we are going to look at the FPM instrument for schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. We're also going to take a look at some common FPM findings from current FPM reviews. The School Support and Improvement Program instrument is often referred to as the SSI FPM instrument. The SSI instrument covers the review of only schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. There are 6 items in the SSI instrument. SSI 1 reviews the school site activities for all schools that have been identified for CSI and ATSI. Items SS 2 through 6 applies only to LEAs who accepted the CSI funds. The items for review for the CSI funds are basically the same fiscal items that are reviewed for other federal programs, and they are allocations and reporting, allowable use of funds, supplement, not supplant, LEA administrative charges, specifically with time and effort, and lastly, LEA equipment inventory. Let's take a look at SSI 1, school site activities, because this item pertains to all the schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. There's 6 different components to this first item in school site activities. 1.0 pertains to schools in CSI. And as it was shared earlier, the requirements for CSI will be reviewed here. And it requires the LEA for each CSI school to locally develop and implement a CSI plan for the school to improve student outcomes, which must be done in partnership with your educational partners. And this means principal and other school leaders, teachers, parents, and family members. And in summary, the CSI plan must be informed by all indicators, include evidence-based interventions, be based on a school level assessment, identify resource inequities, and be approved by the school, LEA, and the state educational agency, which the state has given this responsibility to the county offices. 1.1 and 1.2 are for schools identified for TSI. Although currently there are no schools identified for TSI, you need to know the requirements for TSI, because if your school has been identified for ATSI, then the requirements of ATSI are added to the TSI requirements. So 1.1 refers to the requirement that the LEA must formally notify the schools that they have been identified for TSI, and this notification must include the student subgroups that are consistently underperforming. 1.2 requires the TSI school to develop and implement a school-level TSI plan in partnership with their educational partners. The TSI plan must be informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals, include evidence-based interventions, be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, and it must be monitored by the LEA. 1.3 addresses ATSI schools. So if you have schools that have been identified for ATSI, the LEA must also formally notify the schools that they have been identified for ATSI, and with the inclusion of the student groups that are consistently underperforming. Components that were stated in A, that the ATSI school must develop an ATSI plan that includes all the TSI plan requirements, with the additional required inclusion of identifying resource inequities. So the ATSI plan must be informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals, include evidence-based interventions, identify resource inequities, be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, and be monitored by the LEA. 1.4 applies to the CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. And if a school has an SPSA, this SPA may serve as the school improvement plan as long as the SIPSA meets all the federal requirements. It also allows that single-site school districts and charter schools can use their LCAP as their SIPSA, provided that the LCAP meets the federal school planning requirements, and the educational partner requirement is used as well as it's adopted at a public hearing. And now, during an FPM review, these specific requested evidence for school site activities would be a copy of the LEA notification to schools for TSI and ATSI, a copy of the school improvement plan, which could be the SIPSA or an independent document. And the last requested evidence is the documentation showing the involvement of your educational partners in the development of the plan, such as records of agendas, meeting minutes, attendance sign-in sheets, etc. Here's some findings from current FPM reviews that have taken place. In SSI 1, there was a finding in the disbursement of funds were not aligned with the funding plan reported in the GMART. The CSI expenditures were not aligned with the identified root causes. For ATSI schools, the school was not notified of their support status, or there was no plan in place for eligible ATSI schools. So these were some common findings. The next two slides are the requirements for LEAs who accepted the ESSA CSI funds. You can see here, SSI 2 reviews the allocations and reporting. Again, how the district disperses the CSI funds in accordance with the approved CSI funding plan in the GMART. SSI 3 reviews the allowable use of funds. And this is the review makes sure that the costs are reasonable, necessary, and allocable. The funds must be used for the development of strategies to improve pupil performance only at the CSI schools. And these strategies are to be aligned to the LCAP. It also should be noted that CSI funds cannot be used to hire additional permanent staff. SSI 4 reviews supplement, not supplant. This is to make sure that each school it serves receives all of the state and local funds it would have received in the absence of the school's improvement funds. The other requirement is that the LEA must also show the methodology that was used to allocate the state and local funds to any schools receiving the CSI funds. SSI 5 reviews the LEA administrative charges, specifically with time and effort. The LEA must show how they properly charged and documented the allowable salary and wages that are in accordance with the CSI program requirements. And the last item reviewed in this instrument during an FPM is the SSI 6 equipment inventory. Again, this requirement requires the LEA to maintain a historical inventory record for any piece of equipment with an acquisition cost of $500 or more per unit. The record must describe the acquisition by the components of A through M. 6.1 is the capital expenditures with a unit cost of $5,000 or more, and this must have prior written approval from CDE. Also, the review will look at disposal of equipment and having it noted for current per unit fair market value in excess of $5,000. Also looking at the process for current per unit fair market value less than $5,000. And the review will look at the physical inventory of the property that the district conducted and the results that have been reconciled with the district's official equipment inventory list. And this must be done at least once every 2 years. Here are some other findings for SSI 3 and 5. For SSI 3, it was found that CSI funds were used to benefit non-CSI schools. And in SSI 5, there was a lack of time and effort documentation for CSI funded employees. And another finding was in SSI 5, there was insufficient time and effort, procedures, and internal controls. In other words, there was the procedures and internal controls that was stated, but there was not, it wasn't being followed. So again, when you have your policies and procedures and you're following these, it should lead to the internal controls happening. And so when there's not evidence that this is happening, this too can be a finding. So as a result, these particular reimbursements were required to be made during an FPM review. For SSI 3, because the CSI funds were used for district-wide activities that benefited non-CSI schools, the funds had to be reimbursed. And also for SSI 5, the CSI funds had to be reimbursed because the funds were used for employees who spent time on unallowable activities. So again, it's important to make sure that you follow all the rules and the requirements. Here are some FPM reminders that I leave you with. Ensure that the CSI plan demonstrates alignment between the identified root causes, strategies, and expenditures to be funded with CSI funds. And if adjustments are made to how the funds will be distributed, make sure that your fiscal people know how that's going to be changed in the GMART. There must be alignment. Also ensure CSI funds, including those reserved for use at the district level, are only used to benefit the CSI eligible school. And funds may not be expended district-wide at a non-CSI eligible school. And ensure equipment purchased with CSI funds is inventoried as noted. And lastly, here's some specific reminders regarding time and effort. Ensure that any position that's funded with CSI funds are temporary. Keep time and effort records for any CSI funded position. These positions require the same documentation as other federally funded positions. And time and effort procedures should include all processes of tracking employee time, including extra time that is funded with CSI funds, say for additional assignment or professional development. And now Evan will go over the criteria for exiting.
Thanks, Adrian. And before we finish, because this is the last few slides, just want to remind everyone there are a lot of questions in the chat. We will follow up with a follow-up Q&A that answers all those in details with links. I know there's a lot of urgency around this, but we will get those out to you as soon as we can if we weren't able to answer them today. But go ahead, let's talk about how you get out of this. So first, I will note that, and I didn't put it here, but the exit criteria are not published for the currently identified schools for CSI and ATSI. Only the schools who are in CSI and ATSI, and that's kind of follows the consistent pattern. So if this is a one-year identification cycle, which I noted earlier, then really exiting means not meeting the criteria again next year, which will be the case for a lot of schools because we'll have the addition of change on the dashboard and colors, and there will be a lot of improvement expected, you would think, in even if you still have ongoing issues around some of those indicators like chronic absenteeism, and improvement is likely to move you out of the red category and into a higher category. But I did want to talk about the existing criteria because likely moving forward, this is what will be the criteria used. So for CSI low grad rate, if your graduation rate over the course of 3 years improves to 68% or greater, that would lead to an exit. And that was the case with the currently exiting group. In addition, schools that were eligible for CSI lowest performing, they were moved out most recently if they did not meet any of those CSI status level combination criteria. And this is always the tricky one, at least one state indicator that had a performance color of red or orange on the 2019 dashboard had an improvement status level percent of at least 0.1% for that indicator between 2019 and 2022. And that's the opposite for the LP grad rate and academic indicators. It's an improvement, increase, or for suspension rate, chronic absenteeism, it's a decrease. And I'll explain that a little more in another slide. But next slide, please. So the ATSIX criteria for the current group currently previously identified group were, again, those that were identified initially in 1920. If the school was ATSI in the prior year, but did not have at least one state indicator meeting the N size of 30 or greater in the current year, the school exited ATSI. So this is a big factor. You could go up and down with your size of your groups where you no longer have it. You might have a very small student group that pops on for 1 year, similar to what we showed earlier, for one indicator, and then the next year they're off because you're a pretty small school or that's a very small student group. If you didn't have any indicators, you'd be off. Additionally, schools no longer eligible, similar to CSI, if they didn't meet the criteria again, and they had that slight improvement. So I wanted to know a little bit more about what that improvement was meant. And if you go to the next slide, so I asked the CDE, I said, help us understand the scenario for a school that couldn't exit ATSI, where they didn't meet the criteria, but they also didn't improve 0.1%. My instinct is that this is a criteria to ensure that there has to be actual improvement, not just a change in the number of indicators you have. So let's say you had 2 indicators, one very low, one very high, and then the addition of a third indicator because of those anomalies with student group size adds a third indicator, which is medium. And so even though there's no change in that very low indicator from 1 year to the next, now you don't meet the criteria again. This is what the state said. We are required by the Department of Ed for all schools to demonstrate improvement. So I think that's more or less tacit. Yes, that's what that means. And they noted they'll provide more information on ESSA support identification, exits, and guidance as they get closer to the 2023 dashboard. But basically at this point, if you just don't meet the criteria next year for ATSI or CSI, that would be an exit because it's a one-year list as of right now. So next year they'll be re-identifying all of them again. And that, I believe, if you go to the next slide, we'll open up for questions. Like we've noted before, please put those in the chat. We are right at that 4:30 time, so we'll have to get back to you with answers to those. But I would like to thank my colleagues. Next slide here. My colleagues from the LCAP-State and Federal Programs Unit, my former unit, my good friends and neighbors here, Adrian Balcazar, the project director, Debbie Cano, Helen Choi, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and Anita Lomeli, who's not here today. And then also my colleague Hillary Weissman, we're in the Accountability and Data Literacy Unit. You can visit us at our Canvas page. We will record this and post it on the Canvas page, and we'll send out the Q&A following. We really like to thank you for those of you who hung in here the whole time, and we appreciate your attentiveness, and we will be happy to see you in the future. Thanks for joining us.